The rain had been falling since noon, the kind that streaked the diner's fogged-up windows and pooled in the potholes outside. Inside, the smell of frying onions mixed with the sharp tang of brewed coffee. Plates clattered, chairs scraped, and a jukebox in the corner warbled out an old love song no one was listening to. Grace Miller wove between the tables with the ease of someone who'd been doing this since she was old enough to balance a tray. Her uniform, a faded green dress with the Sunny Diner logo, was clean but worn thin at the seams. Her black sneakers squeaked on the linoleum as she slid another order onto table 3. "Thank you, sweetheart," an older man said, already sprinkling salt on his eggs. Grace smiled, but it was automatic. Her mind was somewhere else, on the stack of unpaid bills tucked inside a biscuit tin in her kitchen cabinet. On the asthma inhaler her little brother Eli was rationing because the pharmacy wouldn't refill without payment. The dinner rush was just dying down when the bell over the door jingled. Grace glanced up out of habit. A man stood in the doorway, tall but slightly hunched, like every step cost him effort. His hair was damp from the rain, his tailored coat clinging to his shoulders. What struck Grace first wasn't his clothes. It was the way his hands trembled as he reached for the nearest chair. Most customers barely looked his way. The busboy muttered something about another drunk wandering in from the storm. Grace didn't buy it. She saw the sheen of sweat on his forehead, the shallow rise and fall of his chest. "Sir," she called gently, stepping closer. He looked up at her with startlingly clear gray eyes, then swayed. In a blink, Grace was at his side, the tray she'd been carrying abandoned on the nearest counter. "Can you hear me?" He tried to answer, but his lips moved without sound. A jolt of fear shot through her. She'd seen her mother collapse once from low blood sugar, and this was the same terrifying slackness in the body, the same fading presence in the eyes. "Someone call 911, she shouted over her shoulder. The man's knees buckled, and Grace caught as much of his weight as she could before lowering him to the floor. She knelt beside him, feeling for a pulse at his neck. It was there, fast and fluttering like a trapped bird. A couple of customers craned their necks but didn't get up. The busboy finally fumbled for his phone. Grace tilted the man's head back, checking his airway. His breathing was shallow, erratic. "Stay with me," she urged, her voice steady even though her heart was thundering. "Help is coming." His hand twitched against hers. She pressed her palm over it. "You're not alone, okay? Just keep breathing for me." The minutes stretched until the wail of sirens cut through the rain. Paramedics burst in, kneeling beside them with equipment. One took over compressions when his breathing hitched. Another fitted an oxygen mask over his face. Grace stayed crouched by his side, answering the medic's quick questions. Yes, he'd just walked in. No, she didn't know his name. Yes, he'd been conscious for a moment. As they lifted him onto the stretcher, one of the medics said, "We've got to go now. Are you family?" Grace hesitated. "No, but I'll come." Without thinking, she followed them into the ambulance. The back doors slammed, and the world narrowed to the rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the rain pounding on the roof. The man's eyelids fluttered open just enough to meet her gaze. His lips moved again, and this time she heard it, faint but clear. "Thank you, you stayed." Then his eyes slid shut, and the paramedic urged, "Ma'am, hold his hand steady, helps keep him calm if he wakes." Grace wrapped her fingers around his, feeling the coolness of his skin. She didn't know who he was or why he'd ended up on her diner floor. She only knew she couldn't let go. The rain had stopped by the time the ambulance pulled away from the hospital. Grace stood on the curb, her hair plastered to her cheeks, watching the red lights disappear into the distance. She'd waited until the nurses assured her the stranger was stable before leaving. They hadn't asked for her name, and she hadn't expected them to. People like her didn't usually appear in anyone's story for long. By the time she trudged into her building, it was almost midnight. The old brick apartments on Jackson Street always smelled faintly of mildew, and the stairwell light had been out for months. Grace climbed the 2 flights by memory, fishing her key from her apron pocket. Inside, the single-room apartment was dim except for the soft glow of the lamp by the sofa. Her brother Eli was asleep there, curled under a worn quilt. His chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, but the faint whistle in his breathing was a constant reminder of the inhaler they couldn't refill until next week. Grace hung her damp coat on the single hook by the door and crouched beside him. She smoothed a stray curl from his forehead. At 14, Eli was tall for his age but still had the thinness of someone who'd grown up without enough. In the tiny kitchenette, she set a kettle on the hot plate and glanced at the biscuit tin on the shelf. Inside, an envelope marked rent due Friday, another for electric disconnect warning, and the pharmacy receipt for Eli's inhaler. She pulled out the last and read the balance again, $62.40, a number that might as well have been $600 given how tips had been lately. She poured tea into a chipped mug and sat at the table with her small spiral notebook. The first page held a neatly written list. Someday cafe menu ideas. Sweet potato pancakes. Cinnamon orange tea. Sunday meat pies. She de-started the list 2 years ago when she first got the diner job. It was a dream she only allowed herself to touch in quiet moments, opening a place of her own, where no one rushed you out for nursing a coffee too long, where she could put her name on the door. The sound of movement made her look up. Eli stood in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "You're late," he mumbled. "Had to stay after," she said. "Someone collapsed at the diner." "Are they okay?" "I think so. They got to the hospital in time." Eli nodded, his gaze drifting to the biscuit tin. "You didn't eat." Grace pushed her tea toward him. "Wasn't hungry." They both knew she was lying. The next morning, Grace tied her hair back and slipped into her cleanest uniform. The green was fading, but at least it didn't have any stains. She met her boss in the back, Mr. Harlan, a man whose entire personality could be summed up as calculating the cost of things. "You're late," he said, checking his watch. "I stayed with a customer who had a medical emergency last night," she explained. "Off the clock." Grace blinked, "Yes." "Then you're lucky I don't dock your hours for walking out with the ambulance." She bit back the reply she wanted to give. Arguing with Mr. Harlan was like shouting at a brick wall. It left you tired and unheard. At the counter, regulars filtered in for breakfast. Grace poured coffee, carried plates, and pretended not to notice when a table left without tipping. Every coin counted, and the empty space in her apron pocket felt heavier than the ones holding change. During the mid-morning lull, she leaned against the counter and let her mind drift to the man she'd helped the night before. His gray eyes, the way he'd looked at her in the ambulance like she'd anchored him in place. She doubted she'd see him again. People like him, clean-cut, wearing coats that probably cost more than her rent, belonged to a different world. But still, she'd stayed. And something about that felt right. 2 floors up from the penthouse suite of Westbridge Medical Center, a private room was quiet except for the steady beeping of a heart monitor. Sunlight spilled across white walls, touching the leather briefcase on the chair, the fresh lilies on the table, the neatly folded designer coat. Ethan Cole lay in the bed, eyes half open, watching the drip chamber of his IV. His dark hair was mussed, the lines around his eyes deeper than the financial magazines made them look. In those glossy pages, he was Ethan Cole, tech visionary, Forbes' youngest billionaire, the man who turned a garage startup into a global empire. Here, stripped of the tailored armor and boardroom lighting, he looked like what he really was, a man who had nearly died. The cardiologist's words still echoed in his head. "Another few minutes without oxygen, and you wouldn't be here." And he knew without her, he wouldn't be. He remembered the blur of the diner, the clink of plates, the scent of coffee, and then her face. A waitress in a faded uniform, kneeling beside him like it was the most natural thing in the world, her voice cutting through the panic. "Stay with me." He'd been surrounded by people all his life, employees, investors, competitors. But in that moment, it was her hand on his that kept him tethered. An assistant entered quietly, placing a tablet on the table. Board wants to reschedule the Singapore call for next week. They also want a public update on your condition. Ethan's gaze stayed on the tablet, but he didn't reach for it. No public statement, not yet. The assistant hesitated. Sir, the press already caught wind. I said not yet, Ethan repeated, his tone soft but final. And find out who she is. Who? The waitress from last night. The assistant's brow furrowed. You want to thank her? I want to know her name, Ethan said, looking toward the window. Everything else we'll decide later. When the assistant left, Ethan let his thoughts wander. For years, he'd moved through the world surrounded by people who calculated his value in stock options and market forecasts. The higher he climbed, the more he became a commodity instead of a person. She hadn't seen any of that. She hadn't known his name, she'd just acted. And for reasons he couldn't quite explain, that mattered more to him than any deal he'd ever closed. He reached for the notepad by his bed and wrote down the only details he remembered. Sunny diner, green uniform, brown hair pulled back, gentle voice. Somewhere in the city, she was probably back at work, pouring coffee for strangers, unaware that the man she'd saved could buy every building on her street and not notice the dent in his bank account. Ethan closed his eyes, a faint smile tugging at his lips. She didn't need to know that, not yet. The lunch rush at Sunny Diner was in full swing when the bell over the door jingled. Grace balanced 2 plates of cheeseburgers on one arm, a coffee pot in the other, barely glancing toward the entrance. She didn't notice him at first, not until he slid into a corner booth in her section. He wore a simple navy sweater, dark jeans, no tie, no watch worth more than her yearly rent. His hair was neatly combed, though there was still something faintly fragile about the way he sat, shoulders a little sloped, like he hadn't fully shaken off the hospital. Grace poured coffee for table 7, dropped off the burgers at table 3, then made her way over. Hi there, she said, setting a menu in front of him. Coffee. He looked up and those gray eyes locked on hers. For a heartbeat, she froze. It's you, he said quietly. Grace frowned. I'm sorry, do we know each other? You stayed, he replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Recognition hit her, and she felt the heat rise in her cheeks. Oh, you're alive, he finished, chuckling softly. Thanks to you. She glanced around. Are you okay now? Better every day. When she reached for the coffee pot, he nodded. Please, black. She poured, careful not to spill. You didn't have to come all the way here to thank me. I did, he said. I remember you riding in the ambulance. You didn't have to do that either. Grace shrugged. Seemed like the right thing. When she walked away to take another order, Ethan studied her from across the room. There was a quiet efficiency in the way she moved, not rushed, but precise, as if she'd learned to measure every step, every word. He'd seen CEOs with less poise in a crisis. He kept the conversation light when she returned, asking about the pie. Try the apple, it's decent if you don't mind canned filling. The weather could use less rain, more sun. And the hours double shift today, she admitted. When the bill came, he tucked cash under the coffee cup, enough to cover the check 3 times over. Grace noticed the thick fold of bills when she cleared the table. Sir. Ethan, he corrected. Ethan, this is too much. Call it appreciation, he said, sliding his coat on. She hesitated, then nodded. Thank you. When he left, she stared at the cash in her hand. For a moment, she considered putting most of it back into the till, but then she thought of Eli's prescription. That night, she walked to the pharmacy and paid for the inhaler in full. It started with once a week. Ethan would slip into the same corner booth, order coffee and pie, and linger just long enough for them to exchange a few easy words. Grace learned he preferred apple pie to cherry, that he never touched sugar, and that he always read a folded newspaper instead of scrolling a phone. Then it became twice a week. Sometimes he brought a book, sometimes he simply watched the rain streak the diner windows while she worked. Grace wasn't sure why she noticed the details. The way his shoulders loosened after she set down his coffee. The quiet way he listened when she mentioned Eli's latest sketch for art class. The fact that he never asked for anything she didn't have time to give. For a man who'd been carried out on a stretcher weeks ago, he seemed oddly at ease in her small corner of the world. One Thursday afternoon, during a rare lull, Ethan caught her passing his booth. "Sit for a minute," he said, gesturing to the opposite seat. "I'm working," she replied automatically. "No one's here," he countered. "Consider it your break." Grace hesitated, then slid into the booth. He studied her for a moment. "You always work double shifts." "Not always," she said, "just most days." "Why?" She almost laughed. "Rent, bills, Eli's school, you pick." His gaze softened. "Eli's your little brother, 14. Thinks he's grown, still can't boil an egg without setting off the smoke alarm." Ethan smiled. "Sounds like a good kid." "He is," she said, the warmth in her tone undeniable. When the bell over the door jingled, she stood, smoothing her apron. Before she walked away, he said, "Grace, I'm glad you stayed that night." She glanced back at him. "Me too." The visits kept coming. Some days he left her small, folded notes under the saucer, nothing romantic, just observations. "The rain sounds better here. Aurelie should try charcoal pencils, better for shading." One night, as she locked up, she found an envelope taped to the diner door. Inside was a voucher for Eli's art supplies store with a simple note, "For the kid who can't boil an egg but might be able to draw the world." Grace pressed the envelope to her chest, her throat tight. She didn't know what to make of Ethan, a quiet man with watchful eyes who seemed to understand more than she said out loud. She told herself it was nothing. People were kind sometimes, that was all. What she didn't know was that across the city, in a glass-walled boardroom on the 45th floor of Cole Innovations, Ethan was signing off on a multi-million-dollar deal while thinking about the way her laugh had caught him off guard that afternoon. She also didn't know that his assistant had been quietly digging for more information about her, and that Ethan had asked for it not to be shared with anyone else. Not yet. For now, he wanted this: the quiet booth, the pie, the woman who didn't know his last name. It was a Saturday morning rush, the kind where the smell of bacon hung thick in the air and every table was full. Grace was balancing coffee refills for 3 booths when the bell above the door jingled. Ethan stepped in, dressed casually, but with that quiet, collected posture she'd come to recognize. He took his usual booth, and she gave him a quick nod before hurrying to drop off plates at table 5. The diner was noisy enough that she almost didn't hear it, the voice that said his name. "Not Ethan. Mr. Cole." Grace glanced up in time to see a sharply dressed man in his 40s approaching Ethan's table. The newcomer had the brisk confidence of someone who was used to getting through locked doors without asking. "Sir," the man said, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the urgency, "the Tokyo deal is in motion. Your team is on standby for your approval." Ethan's gaze flicked toward Grace just for a second before returning to the man. "Not here." "But the board." "Not here." His tone was calm but final. The man hesitated, nodded stiffly, and left as quickly as he'd come. Grace kept moving between tables, but her mind snagged on the exchange. "Mr. Cole, Tokyo deal, board." She'd never asked what Ethan did for work. She'd assumed office job, maybe something in finance, the kind of job that explained his neat handwriting and the way he noticed details. But now, when the rush slowed and she finally approached his booth, he was stirring his coffee as if nothing had happened. "Friend of yours?" she asked, keeping her tone light. "Coworker," he said without looking up. "Must be important. He called you Mr. Cole." He met her gaze then, and for a moment something unreadable passed between them. Some people like titles more than names. She didn't press, but the question lodged in her chest like a stone. That night she sat at her kitchen table while Eli sketched superheroes in his notebook. "What's wrong?" he asked without looking up. Nothing. You have that face you get when you're thinking too hard. Grace exhaled slowly. You ever feel like someone is not telling you the whole story? Eli shrugged. All the time, you for example, about what happened to Mom's old guitar. She smiled faintly despite herself. That's different. Is it? She didn't answer. Across the city, in the dim quiet of his penthouse, Ethan was reading through emails he had no interest in answering. His assistant's latest message was flagged urgent. Grace Miller, waitress at Sunny Diner. Age 26. Guardian to younger brother Elijah 14, parents deceased. No debts beyond rent and utilities. He scrolled past the rest. Ethan closed the file, leaning back in his chair. He told himself he didn't want her to know, not because he didn't trust her, but because once she saw his world, she'd start looking at him differently. Everyone did. And for reasons he didn't fully understand, he wanted to keep this one thing, this version of himself, untouched. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, one of those gray days where the diner's windows blurred with drizzle. The lunch crowd had thinned, and Grace was wiping down the counter when she heard the sound of camera shutters. She glanced outside. Two men with press badges stood near the curb, their cameras aimed straight at the front door. Before she could process it, the bell jingled and Ethan walked in, except he wasn't just Ethan anymore. He was flanked by two sharply dressed men she'd never seen before, and the moment he stepped inside, the reporters outside called his name. Mr. Cole, over here. Grace froze, rag in hand. One of the men with him murmured something, and Ethan's gaze darted toward her. Their eyes met. She moved automatically toward his usual booth, but before she could get there, one of the reporters leaned through the door. Mr. Cole, how does it feel to be back on your feet after the heart scare? Is Cole Innovations going ahead with the Tokyo acquisition? Her steps faltered. Cole Innovations. The name hit her like a physical jolt. She'd heard it before on the news in passing conversations at the diner. Billion-dollar tech company. Headlines about mergers and charitable foundations. Ethan Cole. It was him. He must have seen the shift in her expression, because his voice softened when she reached his table. Grace, you're a billionaire, she said, keeping her tone quiet even though her pulse roared in her ears. He exhaled, a trace of regret in his eyes. Yes. You've been sitting here for weeks eating pie, talking about Eli like you were just, she shook her head. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to see that first. That's not your choice, she said sharply. You think the truth wouldn't change anything, but it already has. The weight in her voice made him flinch. Mr. Harlan, the diner owner, was hovering now, clearly putting two and two together. Cole, as in the coal? Well, why didn't you say so? He said, all oily enthusiasm. You should have told me you had connections, Grace. This is great for business. Grace set the rag on the counter. Not everything's about business, Mr. Harlan. She turned back to Ethan. I have to work. Grace, please. But she was already moving toward another table, her posture stiff, her hands steady only because she forced them to be. That night, she stood in her apartment with the pharmacy bag in one hand and Eli's homework spread across the table. He noticed her quietness almost immediately. What happened? She told him all of it. So he's that Ethan Cole? Eli asked, wide-eyed. Apparently. And you're mad because he didn't tell you. She hesitated. I'm mad because I thought I knew who I was talking to. Now I don't know if he was being real with me or just playing some game. Eli's voice was careful. Maybe he just wanted to be a normal person for a while. Grace stared at the wall. Maybe, but where does that leave me? Meanwhile, in his penthouse, Ethan stood at the window overlooking the city. The rain traced silver lines down the glass, blurring the skyline. He'd faced hostile takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations, and entire boards trying to push him out. None of it had left him feeling as unsettled as the way Grace had looked at him in the diner that afternoon. like she was seeing a stranger. 3 days passed before Ethan came back to the diner. Grace had half hoped he wouldn't. It would be easier to just file him away as another customer who drifted in and out of her life. But on Friday morning, the bell above the door jingled and there he was, dressed in a dark coat, a faint uncertainty in his step. He carried a box, wrapped in plain brown paper. She approached cautiously. "You here for coffee or headlines?" His mouth twitched at the jab, but he didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the box across the counter. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it." Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a full set of professional art supplies: sketchbooks, charcoal pencils, watercolors, brushes, and on top, a voucher for a local art academy's summer program. "For Eli," he said quietly. "He's talented. He should have the chance to learn." Grace's throat tightened. "This is too much." "It's nothing," Ethan replied. "Not compared to what you did for me." Her eyes flicked up to meet his. "That night I didn't know you were a billionaire. I just saw someone who needed help." "And that's exactly why He stopped, choosing his words. "Why I didn't tell you. I liked being just a man who could talk to you without the rest of the world between us." For a moment, she almost softened. Then she remembered the look on the reporters' faces, the cameras clicking like they were capturing a rare animal in the wild. "Ethan, you don't get to hide the truth because it's convenient for you," she said. "That's not how real trust works." He nodded slowly. "I understand, I just don't want to lose this, whatever it is." She glanced down at the box, then back at him. "This isn't how you fix it. You can't buy back trust." His expression tightened, but he didn't argue. He only said, "Then tell me how." "I can't," she replied. "Not right now." When she walked away to take an order, Ethan stayed at the counter, the untouched coffee cooling in front of him. He built an empire by knowing exactly what people wanted before they said it. For the first time in years, he had no idea what move to make next. That night, Grace carried the box home. Eli's eyes went wide as he pulled out the paints and brushes. "Where'd you get these?" he asked. "From someone who wanted to say thank you," she said. Eli hesitated. "You mean Ethan?" "Yes. He's trying, Grace." She gave a faint, tired smile. "Maybe, but I need to know he's not just trying because he feels guilty or because he's used to getting his way." Eli set the brushes down gently. "Maybe you should give him a chance to prove it." She didn't answer, but later that night, when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she realized she wasn't angry anymore, just unsure. Meanwhile, in his penthouse, Ethan sat at his desk long after the city lights blurred into the horizon. His assistant had sent him the Tokyo deal documents twice. He hadn't opened them. All he could think about was the look on her face when she said the word trust. For the first time in his career, he was prepared to walk away from a deal, but not from her. It was a week later when the call came. Grace was in the middle of the Saturday breakfast rush when her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. She almost ignored it until she saw the caller ID, Illy's school. Her stomach dropped. "Hello." "Miss Miller, this is Nurse Campbell. Eli had an asthma attack during gym. We've called an ambulance." The world around her went muffled, the clatter of dishes and murmur of customers fading under the rush of blood in her ears. "I'm on my way," she said, already untying her apron. By the time she reached the hospital, Eli was stable but pale, an oxygen mask resting on his face. Grace gripped his hand. "Hey," she whispered, "you scared me." He managed a weak smile. "Sorry." A doctor came in, explaining that Eli's inhaler had been nearly empty. He needed a new prescription, and this time, a specialist's appointment to adjust his treatment plan. The costs tumbled through Grace's mind before the doctor had even left the room. She was still standing in the hallway, staring at the printout of fees, when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "Grace." She turned. Ethan was there, no coat, no entourage, just him, slightly out of breath like he'd run part of the way. "How did you—" "Your boss called me," he said. Said you left in a hurry. Her eyes burned. He had another attack. She held up the paper. The specialist isn't covered. I don't know how I'm going to. Don't worry about that, Ethan said immediately. Grace shook her head. I told you this isn't about money. I know, he said. Let me help another way. Over the next 3 hours, Ethan never left Eli's side. He fetched water, adjusted the blanket, joked quietly about the hospital food. When the nurse came to check vitals, he asked the right questions, not just about cost, but about what Eli would need at home, how to prevent this from happening again. Grace watched him from the corner of the room. There was no boardroom polish, no billionaire distance. Just a man who cared, completely present, never once reaching for his phone. By the time the doctor cleared Eli to go home, she realized something had shifted. Outside, the evening air was cool, the street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. Ethan offered to drive them, but Grace shook her head. Walking's fine, she said. It's only a few blocks. Halfway home, Eli looked up at him. Thanks for staying, Mr. Ethan. Ethan smiled. Any time. Grace glanced at him, her voice softer now. You didn't have to do all that. I wanted to, he said simply. And if you never let me spend a cent on you again, I'll still show up when you need me. She looked at him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Later that night, after Eli was asleep, she stood at the kitchen window with a mug of tea. She thought about the man in the diner, the cameras outside, the box of art supplies, and the hours he'd spent in that hospital room without once making it about himself. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she could trust him again. 2 weeks later, Grace was back at the diner for the Thursday evening shift. The usual hum of conversation filled the air, but she felt lighter than she had in months. Eli's new treatment plan was working, and he hadn't had a single breathing scare since the hospital. She was refilling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door jingled. Ethan stepped in. This time he wasn't alone. A small group followed him, a woman with a camera, a man carrying flowers, and another holding a box. A table for 5, Grace asked, half teasing, half confused. Ethan smiled, but there was a current of nerves under it. Not exactly. Could you come here for a second? The entire diner seemed to tune in, forks pausing midair. He gestured toward the counter where the box was set down. Grace, he said, his voice steady but warm, you once told me you didn't want trust to be bought. You were right. That's why this isn't about money. He opened the box, revealing a framed certificate and a set of keys. It's the deed to a small storefront 2 blocks from here, he said. You've talked about opening a place where Eli's art could hang on the walls. I've signed it over to your name permanently. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the diner. Grace's hands flew to her mouth. Ethan, I can't. You can, he said, stepping closer. Because it's not payment, it's a promise. A promise that I'm in this not to change who you are, but to stand with you while you build what you want. Her throat tightened. Why would you do this for me? He gave a faint smile. Because you saved my life before you knew who I was. Because you've seen me as a man, not a headline. And because somewhere between the coffee and the pie, I started looking forward to every word you said. There was a stillness in the diner now, the kind that wraps around a moment so it stays sharp in memory. Eli slid off his stool at the counter and joined them, grinning. You should say yes, Grace. She laughed through the tears, threatening to spill. I'm not sure what I'm saying yes to. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. To letting me stay in your life, whatever that looks like. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the billionaire, not the guarded stranger, but the man who had sat by Eli's hospital bed, the man who had eaten pie in her corner booth just to hear her voice. Her answer was simple, yes. The diner broke into applause. Even Mr. Harlan was clapping, muttering something about good publicity. Ethan handed her the keys, his hand lingering over hers for a beat longer than necessary. You'll make it something incredible, he said. With Eli's help, she replied, smiling at her brother. Weeks later, the sign above the storefront read Miller's Place in bold. hand-painted letters. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mingled with the sight of Eli's artwork lining the walls. Every Thursday, Ethan would take his usual booth. No cameras, no reporters, no title, just him. And Grace, refilling his coffee with a smile that told him she knew exactly who he was and trusted him anyway.